Hey everybody, let's talk a little bit about quiz number 2. And we're going to just do like a little review here for quiz 2 and go through some vocabulary words that your authors mention in your textbooks, which are available in Canvas at no extra charge. So starting off, your authors talk about needs, and basically what they argue is that if you know what an audience needs, you will be a better speaker. And so, for example, if the audience needs tacos or food, and you know that, you can adjust your speech accordingly. And they continue on with this and talk about like sort of the biggest name in needs, and that is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Abraham Maslow came up with this concept. And basically, on the physiological level, he talked about breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, homeostasis, excretion. Above that, he talked about safety, which includes security, body, employment, resources, morality, the family, health, property. Above that, he talked about love and belonging, friendship, family, intimacy, esteem, self-esteem, confidence, achievement, respect of others, respect by others, and self-actualization, which included morality, creativity, spontaneity, problem solving, lack of prejudice, and acceptance of facts. In of itself, this was not a big innovation, just to list the needs that people have. But what was important that he came up with was he argued that that these are progressive, meaning that if someone's having an issue with their physiological needs, they're not going to want to hear much from you, speech-wise anyway, about safety. And if they're having issues with safety, they're not going to want to hear much about love. And if they're not feeling like they belong, esteem's not going to be something they're going to want to listen to as much or be as attuned with. So really what he talked about was sort of like wanting to consider like where your audience is at in this. And so for example, if your audience is really hungry or they're feeling unsafe, it's hard to talk about to them about something like self-actualization. Uh, so it's a pretty cool hierarchy model. However, there were some flaws in it, and one of them your authors point out that many times the audiences don't know what they need. Uh, People think they know what they need, but they don't really know what they need. So, for example, when the iPhone came out, Steve Jobs, who invented the iPhone, along with some other folks, he went ahead and did some surveys about whether or not people would like to have a tool like this. So something he said, "Hey, I'm going to give you a tool, and it's going to have a flashlight, and it's going to have compass in it, and you can send messages, and you can do email on it, and um, you can use it to make phone calls, and it'll just do lots of stuff for you." And people are like, "Nah, I don't need that. It's going to cost too much, and it's you have to pay for the phone in the first place, and then you have to pay each month to use it for a data plan. It's just too expensive. I don't want it. I don't need it." And then once he actually had people try it out, then they felt like they really wanted it and even needed it, and now they're saving phones. So a little bit of a flaw in what Flo was saying is theory, but it's just keep that in mind. Continuing on with the discussion of needs, your authors also talk about ethos. And with ethos, of course, we talked about this before. This is what Aristotle referred to as the credibility of the speaker. And with that, you're trying to establish good character. Um, and what he argued, your authors argue here is that if you know what the audience needs, then you'll be able to gain their trust. So that kind of relates into this whole discussion of needs and whatnot. Uh, Also, getting into what your audience wants and adapting to your audience, your authors talk about demographics, kind of looking at the sociocultural characteristics that identify and characterize populations. And that would include things like, for example, looking at the age of your audience, their religion, their income level, their education level, and adjusting accordingly. So, for example, if you have an audience that doesn't play golf, talking to them a lot about golf and using a lot of golf examples in your speeches might not work very well. Your authors also talk about stereotyping. So, is stereotyping, this is generalizing about a group of people and assuming that because a few persons in that group have a characteristics, all of them do. Uh, that's the issue with stereotyping. Your authors encourage you not to stereotype your audience, and also for when you're listening to a speech, if you're in the audience, don't stereotype the speaker. And the example here is me. On average, most Arab men in the United States are Muslim. However, if you meet a specific Arab man and assume he's a Muslim, then they're stereotyping. So, for example, my dad comes from Syria, but I'm not a Muslim. So there's a good example there of stereotyping. Next one is totalizing. This is where you want to avoid totalizing your audience, whether that be totalizing your audience as a speaker, or if you're totalizing a speaker, if you're in the audience, you want to avoid that too. Totalizing is taking one characteristic of a group or person and making that the totality or sum total of that person or group. This happens a lot in the LGBTQ plus community where folks, sort of reduce people to being uh, gay or some version of that, uh, or some other characteristic within the LGBTQ plus community, and just reduce those individuals down to just that one thing. And they might even refer to people erroneously as their gay friend. You know, basically the person is their friend who happens to be gay. Um, they're the characteristic of them being gay is not the main aspect of who they are, perhaps, or it's not the only aspect. It's one of many things that a person might be. So when you try to reduce people down to one thing, that's the issue there. And it can even happen with kids where, kids are really into, I don't know, Pokemon, and then they get every single birthday they get Pokemon presents and they never get any other presents. So they get tired of them because they're reduced to just that one thing. All right, next up we have beliefs. Beliefs are your authors here in this section of the textbook, they distinguish between beliefs, attitudes, and values. So we'll start with beliefs. Beliefs are things that people believe to be true or not. Like, for example, God exists, or people might believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God. So that's a belief. It's a very debatable belief, but it's a debate that's out there. And when we're dealing with this sort of thing, it deals with what is and is not. And that's in contrast to, say, for example, values, which has to do with things being good or bad. Like, for example, God is good or God is bad. Jesus is good, Jesus is bad. Here we get into whether or not Jesus exists. Is he the Son of God or not? Or is he a prophet? Those types of things when you talk about beliefs. When you get to values, you're talking about things being good or bad as such. And then next up, your authors have attitudes. And attitudes refer to our repetitive reactions to things. So we might have an attitude about church where we wake up in the morning and we have a positive attitude. We jump out of bed. We can't wait to get ready. We put on our finest clothing. Um, and we just can't wait to get there early. On the other hand, you might be dragging yourself, or some people might not even go at all. So it's your consistent behavior towards that thing is your attitude. So again, beliefs have to do with what is and is not. Values has to do with what is good is bad. And attitudes is our routine behaviors around a thing. Your authors then go into a discussion of listening and hearing and offer up some suggestions about being a good listener. But they start off by distinguishing between listening and hearing. Hearing is an involuntary process, and it can't be avoided. I guess if someone's booming their speakers outside of your house, if you don't have any earplugs, you have no choice but to hear. But you don't necessarily pay attention. So, for example, listening is where you actually do pay attention to what the other person is saying, and that's where we actually listen, and sometimes we even try to remember what they've said and understand it and whatnot. And so, hearing is just a physiological process of absorbing sound in our ears, whereas listening is when we actually pay attention to what people are saying. Your authors point out that listening is hard work. It's actually harder work than hearing, and it causes you to be tired sometimes afterwards, but it's very nourishing too. And then your authors talk about things that sort of keep us from being good listeners, and one of them is ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is when you use your own cultural measuring stick to measure some other culture. So, for example, the standard wedding dress in the United States is white, and the standard wedding dress in China is red. So, for somebody to decide to judge a Chinese woman, if this American, say, for example, who's judging a Chinese woman for having a red dress, that would be an example of an ethnocentrism. And your authors encourage you not to be ethnocentric when you're giving a speech and also when you're listening to speeches as well. Try to see things from other people's perspective and not use your own cultural values to judge people. Your authors talk about also confirmation bias. This is a barrier to listening. This term means a tendency to search for and interpret information in a way that confirms one's preconceptions. So this might be searching out information. So, for example, if you're very conservative, you might seek out this gentleman here who's Tucker Carlson, who is a conservative commentator, and you might avoid other points of view by liberal commentators like Rachel Maddow. And also, you might, even if you're listening to what a person has to say, you might only like focus in on what actually confirms your point of view and ignore some of the rest. All right, then moving on, your authors talk about the general purpose. Uh, and as you know, we study in this class three general purposes. The first is to inform, the second one is to persuade, and the third one is to entertain. And so for the third speech of the semester, your goal is to inform, and for the fourth speech of the semester, it's to persuade. With informing, you give people information and let them do what they will with it. To persuade, you actually try to get them to change their behaviors sometimes, or change their values, change their attitudes, etc. So, for example, if you had a speech about football, you might want to inform people about football, or maybe you want to persuade them about football. Um, the informative one might just, tell them the rules of football, for example, and or the history of the NFL. The persuasive one might talk about head injuries, even though the players wear helmets, there are still some head injuries in football. And then we don't actually give a speech in this class on to entertain, but that is a thing. And we certainly have entertaining speeches, definitely during the class. There's no doubt, but that's not just our main goal. But the speech to entertain is a speech usually that has a lot of jokes, kind of like a stand-up comedy, except it's different in the sense that it centers around one theme instead of going all over the place. And it usually has some kind of a serious point at the end. And then in contrast, your authors talk about general versus the specific purpose. And the specific purpose would not surprise you that it's more detailed. Um, a specific purpose statement builds on your general purpose, such as to inform, and makes it more specific. Uh, so, for example, you might have something like a general purpose to persuade, and then a specific purpose is to persuade my audience to support campus solutions to rising textbook costs. So you can see the main difference there is just that specificity. Next up, your authors talk about a thesis statement, which we also call a central idea. This is a single declarative statement that outlines the purpose of your speech. And as you know, it's typically followed by a preview statement where we forecast the main points of the speech. Your authors also talk about the iterative aspects of speeches. And this is something you already know about because we're giving extemporaneous speeches. And that is that we've written our speeches out into outlines. We've practiced them very carefully at home. And then when we come into the classroom, the fact that we're able to improvise, freestyle, and ad lib a little bit during the speech, that's the iterative aspect of the speech. And it says here that a speech or document is not always written in the same order as the audience finally experiences it. And in other words, you don't have to follow your outline during the actual speech word for word. Right. And then your authors talk about brainstorming. With brainstorming, we're basically talking about the idea of generating ideas. And one of the things that we do with brainstorming, which was invented by a gentleman named Alex Osborne, is we try not to criticize our ideas while we're coming up with them because we want to open up the doors to more and more possibilities. And if we start coming up with an idea and then criticizing it, coming up with an idea and criticizing it, coming up with an idea and then criticizing it, then that kind of shuts us down. So instead, what we do is try to get all the ideas out and then go back and go through the list and criticize them. They say here brainstorming is the process and practice of searching to find ideas or information. When you brainstorm, you are generating ideas to overcome a barrier or confront a problem, typically. All right, and then the last thing we'll talk about here is the myth that Wikipedia is bad. Some people believe that Wikipedia is bad. In fact, Wikipedia in of itself is not bad. It's not a bad thing to use for your speeches, putting together your speeches. The bad part is when you use it as your only source and you believe everything that they say there without double checking to see if their sources are legit or not. So just double checking it and not making it your whole speech based on Wikipedia is the key there. On the other hand, you don't have to use Wikipedia. Don't feel like you have to use it, but it's not bad to use Wikipedia either. Some people consider it a good starting point. And you'll notice that it is possible to edit Wikipedia and put false information in there. And that's why we always double check things that are in Wikipedia and take a look at the end of the Wikipedia article and see where they got their information and then take a look at those sources to make sure it's legit. But to say that Wikipedia is all bad is not actually true. It's a myth. Also, if you were to say Wikipedia is all good, that would be a problem too. But Wikipedia is a tool and it's useful like other tools. Like anything else, it can be misused sometimes. And if it's used exclusively, yeah, that's not so great. But the overall idea that it's bad is not accurate. All right, so that's our review for quiz. I hope you do well in your quiz. Good luck on it, and have an amazing day. Thank you.